The NHS is the 5th largest employer in the world by headcount. And the first 3 are countries' armies and defense departments. So you've got India's Ministry of Defense, #1. You've got the US Department of Defense, #2. You've got the People's Liberation Army of China. And then you've got Walmart. And then you've got the NHS. So the NHS is the 5th largest employer. That alone is obviously a reason for trade unions to be investing huge amounts of time and resources in trying to organise the workers there. But in the UK, 1 in 17 workers are employees of the NHS, and forecasts for the next 10 years put the figure at potentially moving to 1 in 11, depending on how things progress. So it's such a vast organisation, such an important organisation on so many levels. And within all of those workers that work in the NHS, 70% work in Band 2. Now, for those that don't know, the NHS is kind of graded by bands. There are 9 bands, but technically 11 bands. That basically, the higher up the bands you go, the more money you get. 70% of workers in the NHS are Band 2, so it's an incredibly low-paying organisation and one of the biggest employers in the country that pays very low wages to the largest group of workers. And those are the group of workers that UVW focuses our efforts on. So those are facilities workers. And as we heard from John, 66% are actually in-housed within the NHS, a figure higher than probably most people in this room imagined when people think about outsourcing at NHS. I myself used to think that it was 90%, 95% of all facilities workers that were outsourced, but in fact it's not. It's 27% that are outsourced that we just heard, and 7% on top of that who are outsourced to wholly owned subsidiaries. So even though it's a minority of workers that are outsourced now within the NHS who work in facilities, it's still a huge group. There's an estimate of 100,000 workers, facilities workers within the NHS. So if you take that, I think that figure is the in-house figure. I'm not entirely sure, and I might be able to correct me, but the estimate of 100,000, I think, is those that are employed directly. So if we say there's about 160,000 facilities workers across the NHS, that would leave around 40,000 who are outsourced, which is a huge army of workers, really. And the difference between the outsourced and in-house conditions, as we've heard a little bit, is vast. I mean, in some cases, we're talking about half as little pay. So you get twice as much pay in the NHS as you would outsourced to one of these private companies, ISS, Sodexo, whoever it might be. So the struggle for facilities workers could not mean more to them financially and materially. As I said, you're looking at the doubling of wages in some cases once you're brought in-house and put on weekend and enhanced rates and inner London improvements above the statutory minimums. But also emotionally, it's such an important struggle for our members. You know, you can see the passion in some of their faces here. This photo on the report is from one of our picket lines at St Mary's Hospital that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But, you know, you've got, this is Elaine, for those that want to put a name to a face. That's Hermanka. We've got Manuel there. So these are our members at St Mary's who are striking, you know, for as long and as hard as they could before they got brought in-house, which I'll touch upon in a second. So it really is such an important struggle in the NHS for some of those reasons. And the emotional toll. Facilities workers, they have a much higher sickness absence rates in the NHS than any other group. So it's 33% higher sickness absence levels amongst facilities workers than the average for other NHS workers, right? And also amongst facilities workers, you've got much higher rates of physical illness that lead to sickness absences, much higher. Mental illness, actually, as a reason for sickness absence is a lot lower amongst facilities workers than it is amongst the average, but that doesn't, it's still very high. That just shows how bad conditions are for other NHS workers, not how good conditions are for facilities workers. So the struggle means so much to our members, both emotionally, both physically, and both financially. For them, becoming NHS employees has changed and transformed their lives in all of those different areas. And so it really couldn't be more important as well. And then, of course, you've got everything outlined in this report from John about, you know, the correlation between outsourcing and increasing incidence of MOSA and other hospital-acquired infections and things like that, particularly with cleaners. The other thing quickly to say is that even though we've heard that 66% are in-house, there are a lot of cases that we're discovering where they're not getting NHS terms and conditions. And they're not, it's not because they're wholly owned subsidiaries. So we're currently organising with the facilities workers at St Heliers and Epsom Hospital, which makes a mention in this report. The CEO, they were brought back in-house in 2021. They're not getting NHS terms and conditions. So they're on, many of them are on the old AFC because they've been there long enough to have got that, but all the new ones are getting statutory minimums, and we're looking at how to challenge that at the moment, industrially and potentially legally, which is what I want to talk about, time permitting, a little bit. So yes, even though there are a majority of workers in-house, that doesn't actually mean, and I don't think there's any data, substantive data yet on, you can correct me, how many of those who are in-house don't get AFC? No. There isn't. So it's a lot more. So we've seen this not only in the NHS, we've seen this in universities. University of East London, for example, they brought their security guards back in-house, didn't give them AFC. St Heliers and Epsom Hospital. So we think there's a lot more examples of this, not only in the NHS, but outside the NHS as well, where workers are in-house, but they're given these second-rate contracts still, and they're kind of kept on their second-rate contracts for forever and more. So that's another big challenge for unions to kind of wake up to as well. It's not just about in-housing, it's about equality within in-housing. So just want to mention the two strands, the two ways that we're challenging outsourcing. One is industrially and one is legally. So industrially, we really started our fight against outsourcing in the NHS in St Mary's Hospital, which, as I said, the photo on the report is a picture from. We didn't believe that we could achieve what we set out to achieve, if I'm honest, but we were kind of mad enough to give it a go nonetheless. And I think now we've done that, it has produced, in my opinion, a blueprint of what can be done elsewhere. Now, that struggle was so difficult, and I think what I want to say here today is that though we ended with forcing Imperial Trust to bring all of the facilities workers in-house, there were 1,200 of them, which is huge. It was so hard to get there. It was so difficult, and it took so much effort that the amount of resource, the amount of energy, the amount of kind of creativity and strategy that needs to be put into these disputes is substantial. And so if there's going to be a concerted effort against outsourcing in the NHS, it's not going to come through traditional kind of dispute resolution procedures, let's say, for want of a better phrase, in my opinion. Imperial Trust at no point before agreeing to in-house everyone had it in their mind to do so. In fact, they were repeatedly sending out communications to our members that they would never in a million years hire them directly as NHS employees, and that they were all delusional and they were all wasting their time and money in continuing what was described by them as a futile dispute and a futile strike. And our members had to go to such great lengths in order to win. They had to occupy the hospital. Now, that's not a very common thing to see, but they had to, in their view, do that because it was the only way they could bring the decision makers to the table, and they succeeded in doing that by occupying the hospital. They occupied the hospital actually more than once. They were blocking nearby roads and allowing ambulances to pass, needless to say, but nonetheless they were blocking nearby roads in order to kind of have an impact that way. And their pickets were as loud and as big as they could be. Now, this might sound quite normal or not, but those were great lengths that those workers had to go to, and they took great risks in going to those lengths. And so if there is going to be a fight that's going to see outsourcing ended in the NHS, it is going to take a huge amount of effort. We've seen other trusts in-house for different reasons, often for clinical reasons or cost reasons that we've heard. St Bart's is now the biggest trust of in-house its workers, 1,800 facilities workers, which is, amazing to see. It didn't quite come on the back of a dispute in the same way St Mary's did, in the traditional way, but it shows that trusts are willing to kind of be forced. But they have to be forced, and I don't think it's reason that we can use or really arguments that we can use with them. We need to force them, and that's the same for most employers when it comes to facilities workers, that they have to be forced to do the right thing. The other way that we are, so short of time, the other way that we are challenging outsourcing is legally. Now, on the one hand, we've got these disputes running at the moment in various NHS trusts, and we hope that those will lead to more in-housing wins. But legally, we've got a case in the Supreme Court that's been lodged, an appeal has been lodged in the Supreme Court, which will be the first case in the country, test case in the country, to decide whether or not you can argue in law that when you've got a group of workers who are majority black and ethnic minority workers on worse terms and conditions than majority in-house workers in the NHS, whether or not that breaches the Equality Act in an outsourcing setup. Now, we won the tribunal claim, we lost the EAT claim, we lost the Court of Appeal claim, and now we've appealed to the Supreme Court, and we're waiting on them to decide whether or not they accept that appeal. If that appeal is accepted and if we go on to win, the consequences are huge. It's hard to overstate what that will mean. And what I hope it means is that every union in the country just brings legal claims against every single public institution on behalf of all their facilities workers and recruits every facilities workers out there, because that will force them to offer parity. That's the argument. And of course, as we know, as we've heard from John, the only reason to outsource is cost. So once that benefit of outsourcing of cost is removed because they're forced under the Equality Act to offer parity, then of course the reason to outsource disappears, and then they will naturally get brought in-house as employees of the NHS. So we've got that claim. We've got another claim against Great Ormond Street Hospital at the moment in the Employment Appeal Tribunal. We've got a claim against the Ministry of Justice at the moment as well, which has just gone through the Employment Appeal Tribunal. So these legal claims are unprecedented. They've never been tried and tested before, so we're the first union doing that with the support, I should say, actually, of someone in the audience here who's supporting us, Richard O'Keefe, with some of these claims, which is great. So you can chat to him afterwards if you want to get more into the nitty-gritty of the legal stuff of these claims. But yes, we're doing everything we can, and I have to say that there's a lot more that could be done. UVW is not big enough to take on this fight alone, and there are, thankfully, other unions that are now stepping up and prioritising the struggle of facilities workers, but certainly not at the scale that it deserves to be fought at. This battle deserves to be fought on a national scale. Every union should be sending organisers out into every single NHS trust to speak to workers, to recruit workers, and ultimately organise workers into action against outsourcing. It could absolutely happen if there was that strategic focus, that prioritisation in strategy and that determination. The one thing the union movement doesn't have a problem with, there's lots of problems in the union movement, but the one thing it doesn't have a problem with is money. It's got so much money. The union movement in this country is so rich. They've got plenty of resources that they could invest and deploy into these struggles, and hopefully that will happen. And that's certainly UVW's dream. You know, we are limited in what we can do and achieve, though we're proud of what we have done and achieved, and we hope that we can kind of play the role of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, and that, you know, I don't know if anyone here works in other trade unions, but if you do, yeah, I hope you can kind of go back to your unions, whatever those unions might be, within the NHS and beyond, and start to talk to people in those unions about how the struggle against outsourcing kind of get the priority that it really deserves and needs, not only for the workers, but for the patients and for the country as a whole. And I'll leave it at that, because I'm over time. Thank you very much.